I'm Mica.
I am John.
John, guess what?
What?
It's time for the loot box beatdown!
Son of a bitch.
Loot boxes have been all over the news lately. They've been popping up in more and more high-profile games, and some have even called them a form of gambling. But could governments now be getting involved in the issue?
Maybe. I would imagine that's why we're doing a news story about it. It could happen after one British lawmaker jumped right into the middle of the loot box controversy. And if a major government ends up regulating microtransactions in video games, the results could be felt all across the gaming world.
Okay, so here is some background. Recently, Daniel Zeichner, a member of parliament in the UK, submitted 2 questions to the UK Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. In his questions, Zeichner asked about the legality of loot boxes and if steps can be taken to regulate them.
One of his questions asks what steps the Secretary of State plans to take to help protect vulnerable adults and children from illegal gambling, in-game gambling, and loot boxes within computer games.
So, yeah, right there, he's putting loot boxes in some pretty bad company. Another of his questions brings up the Isle of Man, which is a British territory that has enhanced protections against illegal and in-game gambling and loot boxes. Zeichner asks if those protections could be adopted throughout the rest of the UK.
Those questions apparently came on behalf of one of Zeichner's constituents who posted on Reddit about the issue. The Redditor named Artfunkel wrote, "The goal here is to see the UK's existing gambling regulations applied to loot boxes."
And again, this is really early, but it is an example of at least one lawmaker taking the issue of loot boxes very seriously.
Yeah, really seriously. Meanwhile, there's an online petition to the UK government asking it to adapt its gambling laws to include gambling in video games, which targets children. The petition says many video game companies in recent years have introduced mechanics which are essentially gambling, of which are targeted at children and vulnerable adults. Gambling in video games mostly involves loot boxes where players use virtual currency, often bought with real money, to earn in-game items, often worth less than what they paid, sometimes more, hence it's gambling.
The petition has gotten more than 11,000 signatures, which means that the government will respond to it, so we'll have to wait and see if anything actually comes of this.
Loot boxes and microtransactions have been a heated topic of conversation recently, as they've been popping up in full-price games like Forza 7 Motorsport, Middle-earth Shadow of War, and NBA 2K18.
And while some loot boxes just contain cosmetic items like skins and costumes, there has also been a bit of creeping trend in other games to include weapon upgrades and other items that can affect a character's progression. And that crosses a line for a lot of gamers into the dreaded pay-to-win category.
The review aggregator site OpenCritic says that it will soon start adding information about a game's business model, in addition to its review score, in order to communicate to players how prevalent loot boxes are in a game.
And this isn't the first time this question has been raised about whether or not loot boxes are a form of gambling.
The popular YouTuber Total Biscuit recently called for more regulation on loot boxes from the American Video Games Rating Board, the ESRB. Total Biscuit said, "Look, if you include these kind of mechanics in these games and you actually allow people to buy these packs for real money and engage in what is essentially a form of gambling, then you should be jacking the rating of your game up to mature."
That would be huge because it would mean that the industry would have to start rating loot boxes games with mature or adult-only ratings, which would lead to less games with loot boxes because nobody wants that rating.
Yeah, and if loot boxes go away, that would be a huge shift in how some games make their money. While the base price of a game hasn't gone up in years, more and more we see developers of AAA games adding microtransactions like loot boxes so they can further monetize their players.
Usually when developers are asked about loot boxes, they stress that their game can be enjoyed without them and that they're just a bonus for people who choose to go that route.
Yeah, that was the explanation from Shadow of War's design director Bob Roberts, who defended the way that developer Monolith Productions implemented the loot boxes in the game. He told Eurogamer, "We do a ton of playtesting and make sure it is tuned to a setting where people can enjoy it. We kept all the loot boxes and the economy of real-world money turned off in playtesting, so we know we are balancing around an experience which is rewarding without any of that stuff."
When Eurogamer asked if it was fair that full-price games have loot boxes in them, Roberts replied, "You put your $60 in for a big game like ours up front, and our focus is that initial purchase price is more than worth it. You want people to be pleasantly surprised by how much stuff is in it."
As for the issue of gambling, game ratings boards have said the loot boxes are not the same as gambling. The ESRB said in a statement to Kotaku, ESRB does not consider loot boxes to be gambling. While there's an element of chance in these mechanics, the player is always guaranteed to receive in-game content, even if the player unfortunately receives something they don't want.
WCCF Tech asked Pan-European Game Information Group, or PEGI for short, then they basically agreed with the ESRB, saying, the main reason for this is that we cannot define what constitutes as gambling. That is the responsibility of a National Gambling Commission.
But while the ratings boards don't consider loot boxes to be a problem, at least one major government has required more transparency from developers around the issue.
Earlier this year, a law went into effect in China that forced game makers to publish the odds of getting items from loot boxes, and one major developer, Riot Games, revealed some interesting information on some of its League of Legends loot boxes, with gamers only having a 2% chance to unlock the rarest items. While this law just applies to China, it's safe to assume that the rest of the world is taking notice.
So yeah, while loot boxes have been around for quite a while, it feels like things are coming to a head with lots of gamers and even a review site saying that they've gone too far and now it looks like governments might start stepping in.
So what do you guys think of the UK government possibly getting involved in the issue of loot boxes? Let us know in the comments.
And for all your video game news, whether or not they have loot boxes in them, be sure to like this video, and if you're new around here, subscribe to the know.
Thanks for tuning in to the Loot Box Beatdown. So, because I buy loot boxes every Overwatch event, does that make me a vulnerable adult?
You have an addiction.
No. Damn it. Recently, Daniel Zeichner?
His name has a question mark at the end.
Recently, Daniel Zeichner, a member of parliament in the UK, submitted 2 questions to the UK's Secretary of